Welcome to Global Forum, a forum for discussion of global issues from global perspectives. Today we are going to discuss the issue of the American empire, its roadmap, its changing focus, and its changing internal balance of forces. We invited three very distinguished friends. You know them already, so I'm just going to briefly mention their names and their most recent books. To my left is sitting Professor Michael Parenti, whose latest book is the Michael Parenti Reader, came out last year. He is author of numerous books, and most people know him as a voice of critical inquiry into American political affairs.
It's called Contrary Notions.
The main title is Contrary Notions, the Michael Parenti Reader.
Right.
The book came out last year. Next to him is Tariq Ali, who's author of 22 books. His latest book is The Dual Pakistan on the Flight Path of American Power. Again, a known person on the international media, truly a global speaker and a global voice right now. And again, we are very delighted to have another friend in company with us, and again, author of a recent book, The War Conspiracy, JFK, 9/11, and the Deep Politics of the War, Professor Peter Dale Scott. I'm very pleased to have every one of you on this table. Thank you for being here. And my main question today is, what is the American agenda for the world hereafter?
Well, since 2001, when George Bush was able to somehow attain the presidency, we've had a small group behind him with a very clear agenda. That I'm talking about the neocons, led obviously by Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. And for 20 years, these people had been working on what they call continuity of government plans, which were actually implemented on September the 11th, 2001. We don't know exactly what was implemented, but the description of the plans back in the 80s with Oliver North was for vast centralization of power in the White House and exclusion of both Congress and the courts, so that we now have things that were advocated in the 80s, warrantless surveillance, warrantless detention, and preparations for martial law in this country. This is a very big change in the nature of American civil life. And of course, it's positively Orwellian to call that continuity of government when it's a change of government. But COG is a real fact that we have to deal with in this country now.
And
they also, that same group that you're talking about, many of them, that was Rumsfeld, Cheney, Abrams, Cohen, Wolfowitz, were centered in a right-wing think tank called Project for a New American Century. And they issued a statement, which, by the way, you can no longer find on the internet. It's been taken
It's
out.
disappeared.
Yeah, it's disappeared. But the statement was called Rebuilding America's Defenses, where they very clearly said, we have an unprecedented opportunity to have a global lock on all the world's resources and markets. And that's what they seem to be going for, that now they've reached the final solution. They could isolate, break up, or hamstring the other large powers in the world.
Before I bring Tariq Ali on, was it correct understanding of their position, one, that they can have this lock over world resources, secondly, they can indefinitely perpetuate American power and domination, and third, they can try to recreate the whole world in their own image? Will you say that was...
And to dominate not only America's opponents, but also their allies.
Absolutely.
It was sidelining Europe in particular. And just one qualification, they said all of this may be difficult to achieve absent a major disaster, a new Pearl Harbor.
Right, because the American public, it doesn't look like they're ready to commit to this grandiose plan.
And it's so really that's why September the 11th, 2001 is an important event.
Very godsend.
Yes.
Tariq, what do you...
Well, this is true. I agree with colleagues here. But let's just see what's actually happened. They went into Iraq thinking it would be a cakewalk, and it turned out to be a disaster for them. I was deeply shocked. You know, I don't live in this country. I live in London. I come here a lot. But watching the presidential debate, the first presidential debate between Obama and McCain, they were talking about U.S. deaths, the tragedy of over 4,000 U.S. soldiers killed in Iraq. Both of them talked about the families, the vets. And I said, yeah, it's a great pity. These 4,000 lives plus should not have been lost. But I couldn't help thinking about the million Iraqi lives lost. We now know that over 1 million Iraqis have died under their watch. We know that there are 2.5 million Iraqi refugees seeking asylum wherever they can get it. We know that the entire social infrastructure of that country has been destroyed by this war. So when I talk about Iraq or think about Iraq, I think about what's been done to that country. And now a similar situation is developing in Afghanistan. But they're having problems. They know it. Essentially, what the war in Iraq has done is, and the occupation of Iraq has done, is made Iran the regional power in that area. There's no doubt about it. This has been the direct effect of the U.S. occupation. They've made the Iranians very strong.
And in addition, if I could say, for something that Iran has sought for many, many years, they now have power over the Shia in southern Iraq, which has been one of their strategic objectives, being handed to them on a plate by the United States.
But let's look at one other aspect of it, which is that the United States is militarily very strong, but as we now see, and the whole of America knows it, it is economically rather weak. The economy is weak, and this is bound to affect its foreign policy too. And secondly, what we are seeing is strong regional powers mimicking the United States, saying if you can do it, if you can have preemptive strikes, we can too. That's what the Russians did in Georgia. Repeated the exact mechanism of what the West did in the former Yugoslavia. You gave Kosovo independence, said the Russians. We warned you not to, because we are now giving independence to Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So not having any norms by which the world can live is no longer working. The US thought it could breach all norms because it was the strong power. Now others are saying, if you can do it, we can do it. Tomorrow the Indians will do it. The day after the Chinese will do it. The Brazilians might do it in Latin America, and then where will we be? But the fact that this is happening, I'm sure, is giving US policymakers some thought for pause, saying, hang on a minute, what is going on?
And I'd just like to add to that, that once America had put its 1,000 troops or more into Georgia, it was the end of the sort of entente between Russia and America of zones of influence. And now the Russians have just conducted joint war games with Venezuela in the Caribbean. This would have been unthinkable in the old days, but the whole Bush idea was treaties are something that gets in the way, international law, international tribunals. We don't want to have anything to do with that. But they are suffering. They are suffering because, in fact, American stability and American security has been based on a world order which has essentially been torn up by these neocons.
Well, but let's go to Iraq one more time and look at what happened in Iraq. The idea was, we'll overthrow the regime, we'll bring down the state, we will reorganize the state, the region, and even the religion. That was the whole hope. Regime change, region change, and then some extremists want to go and change the religion even. That's why Time magazine in 2003 had a cover story said, should Christians convert Muslims? That was the cover story in the Time magazine. And they showed 10,000 missionaries that had gone to Iraq. One wonders who gave them the visas to go to Iraq at that time. But coming back to issue at hand, let's talk about the non-state actors that have come out of this exercise. There's a new phenomena of non-state actors, because the assumption was you demolish the state, the job is done, then you can rebuild it. But something popped out of that was non-state actor. And we have seen non-state actors not only in Iraq now, but many, many other places. How do we contemplate the role of non-state actors in the future of the Middle East and beyond?
Could I just back up a little bit about the ministers, missionaries?
Missionaries.
You know, of course, I don't have to tell you that missionaries have often been the handmaidens of imperialism for a few hundred years in different places. They come in and they put on their cell and sell their particular god, and that god fits in with the colonizing power. So
absolutely. Act 2 that was started as Act 1, in the sense that people were not ready for that. They had not been defeated to the level and not sort of, made to regret their own faith to a level where they could be proselytized in a manner of Christianity.
Right. The Christian missionaries will not have the success they have in Central America as they're doing right now, and not in Iraq. I don't think so.
No, but that's not the main issue, right? I'm asking.
Yeah.
I'm asking the role of the non-state actor. What's the role of the
Well,
non-state
I
actor?
would like to respond to that question by pointing to this fundamental paradox of the extreme right in this country, the neocons. They want a strong empire, but they're hostile to the whole idea of state involvement. So one of the countries where we've seen the rise of non-state actors is this country. We now have private military companies with a great deal of offloading of the former business of conducting warfare out of the Pentagon, to private companies, some of which are owned by people extreme right wing, so they then make profits with public dollars, which then are folded back into the American political process on the extreme right. When Rumsfeld came to the Pentagon in 2001, he talked about the enemy, and the enemy was 70,000 Pentagon bureaucrats, and he gave them warning that he intended to redesign the Pentagon so that those functions would go out of the state somewhere else.
Total
Again,
failure, because the Pentagon budget has since then doubled, more than doubled. The
Yes.
Pentagon bureaucracy has grown, and the amount of waste and corruption, unaccounted for funds,
Trillions.
has increased. Yeah, trillions of it. But that raises the question that the empire feeds off the republic, and what we've seen, another victim of U.S. imperialism, is the U.S. itself. I mean, this country is falling apart. I know Tariq, he must travel around. I do. I feel I'm always in the same place. I go to this state, that city, and I pick up the paper, and it's always the same. City council facing budget crises, a state facing record deficit, this and that, cutbacks in this, cutbacks in that. So the empire is literally devouring the republic, and we see the near meltdown effects of that are this past week.
But you see, the other side of non-state actors, one is, of course, neoliberalism, privatizing war, creating companies linked to the Pentagon with ex-Pentagon people and ex-senior people on the boards of these companies. So Blackwater is a big example of that, but it also serves another purpose, that they can no longer recruit enough people to a totally volunteer army. In the second and third year of the war in Iraq, once a resistance there had emerged, the number of people wanting to join the U.S. Army, not the Air Force so much, but the Army, was right down. There was panic in the United States. They were taking people from the National Guard in Vermont who didn't join up for that and sending them into Iraq. So they had
and sending them back for a second tour. Yes,
and so they had to organize these. The choice was either to increase the mercenaries. That's what they are. They call them private contractors, but good old-fashioned word for this is mercenaries, people you buy to go and kill in other parts of the world. The only other choice was to reintroduce conscription. And if they were to do that, the country would explode, because conscription is democratic. It affects every single family in the country. And they were not going to make that mistake, knowing what happened during the Vietnam War. So they went for these mercenaries, and they're increasingly now going in that direction in Afghanistan as well.
One other population stream they've tapped into, it's a small one, but it should be mentioned, are non-citizens and immigrants. They've actually put these people in the military with the promise that if they served, they would have citizenship when they got out, if they got out all in one piece.
and meanwhile Blackwater recruits from the former dictatorships in Latin America. So there are a lot of veterans of Chile under Pinochet who, of course, were trained in all kinds of extreme activities, who are in Blackwater. Blackwater hasn't just been used in Iraq, it was also used in New Orleans after the Katrina hurricane. You had these very dubious mercenaries armed and with power to shoot and kill Americans, and not necessarily even American citizens behind the gun.
Peter, let me add a footnote to what you just said. I was in South Africa a few years ago and speaking at a meeting, and someone sent me a note, had just come in very excited. Evidently, the white South African who tortured and killed Steve Biko, the black consciousness leader in South Africa, was fighting in Iraq and had just been killed. And they said, could you just read this news item out?
Yes.
Well, I read it out and the whole meeting erupted.
Was he fighting as an American soldier or as
No,
a mercenary?
as a mercenary.
As a mercenary.
But I think that that point is very nicely made, that what we have is empire devouring the republic. Let's go to Middle East and beyond and see rise of the non-state actor in the global fight against hegemony and domination. How is that playing out?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean, but in the case
I mean
of,
by, let's say, Lebanon, we have Hezbollah.
I see, yes.
I mean, non-state actors propping up all over the place, not just one country.
Well, I think to go back to one of the
Popular insurgencies,
sources is Pakistan has been very changed by the enormous amount of American resources that were behind ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency. And they in turn had their own agenda, which was not always the agenda of civilian leaders in Pakistan, and they have put money into the training of people to fight in Kashmir and India. So Iran has been doing the same thing. It's a precedent, really, for the whole region that states back powers fighting elsewhere. I believe that Hamas was originally encouraged by Mossad and the Americans as the counterweight to the PLO and al-Fatah.
Yeah.
And it's sort of blown back in their face that if you do this and weaken the governments everywhere, which of course Syria, I think, is now stable, but it had a terrible problem at one time. Lebanon has been at least twice destroyed by these non-state actors. And of course, to put the pieces together again in Palestine is going to be extremely difficult.
But at the same time, it's going to be extremely difficult also to make Palestinians fall in line just because you happen to control or intimidate one faction. Other
Yes.
factions are not going to fall in line.
Exactly.
So I think this phenomenon, non-state actor, needs to examine a little more closely, both at the regional level and at the country level and at the movement level, because the idea was you topple the government, you bring into your fold Musharraf or anybody else, and the job is done. Now that's not going to be the case. People are going to fight in different ways. I'm just wondering if you're reflecting, Tariq, your reflection.
Well, I think this is happening, and this is a process which was started, of course, in Pakistan and Afghanistan during when the Russians occupied Afghanistan, the creation of non-state groups by the ISI, backed by the United States at that time, funded by the United States to go and take on the Russians, has now become an epidemic. I mean, that's when it was started. All these people the US are trying to get hold of now were people who fought with them. And it's always worth reminding people of that for the following reason, that the mistakes that they made at that time, they're now repeating different mistakes now, which could have equally sort of strong repercussions 5-6 years from now. They never learn. But what is going on is that the groups now fighting the United States inside Afghanistan, the British intelligence refers to these as the neo-Taliban. They say this is no longer the old organization.
They have a global perspective, don't they?
They basically, it's a form of Pashtun nationalism which is now developing in that part of the world. And lots of ordinary Pashtuns are joining this group and transforming it because they want to get rid of the occupation. We must, there are different groups in different parts of the world. Al-Qaeda is not this neo-Taliban. They are a separate group who believe in terror and organized terror. But, in order to, they are not the serious problem for the United States at the moment. At the moment, it's just a psychological problem for them. The real problem for them is the rise of the Pashtuns underneath the umbrella of the Taliban, who have now made it impossible for the United States to win this war. They can send 100,000 more troops. They're not going to win the war, which is why I think Senator Obama is very seriously misguided in the arguments he's putting forward in this presidential campaign. And making excuses because the war in Afghanistan is going wrong, saying the reason it's going wrong is Pakistan, and let's cross over the border and create a mess there too, is not going to help. In fact, it is going to destroy the stability of that country completely, and it's in a mess anyway, as we know.
My two most reliable sources about anything that happens in Central Asia, one of them is sitting right here, Tariq Ali, and the other is my son Christian Parenti, who's been to Afghanistan about 4 or 5 times, much to my grief. But he says that the NATO forces are not leaving their barracks, except for the Americans occasionally maybe, but the Danes or Germans or whatever these other groups, they just seal up in there and barely come peek out over the sandbags from time to time.
They wait for the weekends where they organize large parties and fancy dress parties.
We're not going to win a war that way.
Well, no.
And then there's, of course, the problem of the drug traffic. The Americans imported drug traffickers into Afghanistan in 2001. They had connections with them from the 1980s, and in fact, America, in a sense, bears a very heavy responsibility for the buildup of the export of heroin out of Afghanistan. Now 93% of the world's heroin comes from either Afghanistan or the frontier provinces of Pakistan. The bulk of U.S. aid, thanks to ISI, went to one man, Hekmatyar, who in that period was the #1 drug trafficker in the world, with his own heroin labs in ISI-controlled territory inside Afghanistan. 2001, after the Taliban for at least a year had effectively outlawed it is possible, they were able to do it, the United States brought drug traffickers. They found one man in Dijon, France, and said, you have to come back, we're opening up the country again. And of course now the drug traffic is totally out of control of the Americans and is feeding and nourishing the Taliban. So it's...
But also, Peter, U.S. intelligence experts and drug agency experts now say that this Karzai government is also feeding off the drug trade, and that Karzai's brother is one of the biggest heroin smugglers in the country.
Yes, and they don't, of course, talk about that.
By extension, in the world, he is one, yeah. And also the fact that Russians are playing a very important role in facilitating or letting it go through their territories.
Yes.
And therefore feeding the fire that they feel that they are right now, paying back the Americans for what they had done to them. But again, I want to ask you how that plays out for the American empire in the sense of neocon agenda. What happens when unexpectedly you have these new non-state actors coming up who are going to resist and fight against you? What happens then?
I think America's gone from an offensive phase in the, roughly speaking, the first George W. Bush administration, to now they're just struggling to keep their heads above water. The amount of money that's gone into the war is certainly a factor in this domestic financial meltdown that we're dealing with. America cannot really be... For 50 years, starting after World War II, American strength was based on a balance between economic dominance and military dominance. And roughly, I would say, with the Reagan era, they decided to go with military dominance and then let the free market take care of the rest. So America is now, this has happened to other powers too. It happened to Britain, it happened to the Netherlands, Spain. You're left with an army which you really can't afford anymore, and the whole idea of controlling the world cannot be done by armies alone. It's the civilian economies that count, and here America is now visibly very weak and indebted to the tolerance of countries like China.
There are some immediate gains for the empire builders in Iraq. It allowed Bush to almost double the military budget. they went in and completely privatized the economy. They destroyed the economy,
Yeah.
but they had special committees to privatize it. And Donald Rumsfeld, I thought he used a very amusing, interesting word. He said, it's a Stalinist economy. Everything was state-owned, so they got rid of that. They got rid of the French, Chinese, Brazilian, Italian, and Russian oil prospecting contracts that Saddam Hussein was cultivating. There's only British and American now who are on the oil.
You know, another thing.
And they have contracts there's about 100 companies that have made the most lucrative amounts of money on contracts in Iraq. I mean, that's the biggest profit area they've had in the last decade.
And most of them have them without a bidding process.
No bidding, right.
bidding,
The
you know,
biggest
it's
ones,
yeah.
particularly.
Yeah, non-bidding.
Also, you know, Saddam was moving in his last years towards accepting, if he shipped oil to Europe, it was going to be paid in euros.
I meant to mention that.
And
right.
that a
Reserve
key,
currency.
you know, when I've been saying since before we went into Iraq, if you say it's all about oil, it isn't that we want in America to have the Iraqi oil. It's going to go elsewhere. America wants to have control of the global oil market and to maintain something that was worked out with OPEC and Saudi Arabia, that all OPEC oil would be paid for in dollars. Now that's very anachronistic now, and I think the collapse of the American effort in Iraq means that it's not going to endure. Iran is another country that also started to move towards paying in euros, and that's when we started to hear that America...
I want to tell a little story on that. One of the Arab American intellectuals one time told one of the Saudi princes that they should accept payment not only in dollars but in a basket of currencies, and gave him reason why they should do that. And the prince seemed to be quite impressed with that. And then he met him after a few months. He says, what came of that idea I gave you a few months ago? He said, I discussed with the American ambassador. He didn't like it. So that much for that idea. But really, coming back to the issue that we have now, yes, the oil, hold on oil is strong. And as the big new Brzezinski in his book Game Plan had said, the only leverage you have left over Europe is control of oil. If we lose that control, we lose Europe, and they'll go in different ways, different directions. But at the same time, the prospects for increasing insurgency all over the Muslim world are increasing, not decreasing. How do you think neocons take that into account, given that they have the hold, but hold seems to be tenuous? So how are they going to make it more permanent, given that more they hold on to it, the more insurgencies they produce?
One of the things about the neocons is that they felt that it wasn't important to know very much about a country. If you had a powerful agenda, you impose it, then everything will work out. For example, Wolfowitz said, you won't have a Shia-Sunni problem in Iraq. They will all be grateful to have the Americans impose a secular government. I don't think the neocons have much depth in the area of how to relate to the Muslim world. And this is a very good reason why we should get rid of them as quickly as possible, because over and over, you know, between the State Department and the Defense Department, I usually don't care much for either of them, but certainly what the State Department has been working for is closer to what I would want to see than the Pentagon. The neocon agenda was to create a new State Department inside the Pentagon, or when Rumsfeld left, out in Vice President Cheney's office, and to simply bypass the State Department. It's going to be very, very bad for the whole world until you eliminate the residues of that kind of alternative government that was coming out of Cheney and
But
Rumsfeld.
did you see any possibility of that in yesterday's presidential debate, that any of that is going to
No,
likely
there's
to
narrow parameters. It's
Well,
very
given the compulsions of the empire and the new empire regulators, who are like one of whom is going to be the next president, what possibilities do we see?
Well, I mean, this is the tragedy of the United States. As Michael was saying, that the Constitution has been violated, the Republic is under attack, the diversity that used to exist in this country, I mean, I remember it well. You know, when there was a foreign policy disaster like Vietnam, Senator Fulbright, at the Foreign Relations Committee at the Senate, called them in and held them to account. What the hell is going on? What are you doing? That's all gone. I mean, most of the Democrats voted for this neocon war. We shouldn't forget that. There was a consensus on this war between the two wings of the U.S. establishment. Obama did oppose it, it's true, but he was a rookie. By and large, the Democratic Party leadership went along for it. Clinton came and told the Labour Party conference in Britain, you've got to back Blair. So it's not simply, the neocons aren't the only problem. One of the problems we confront is that there is no serious debate on foreign policy within the mainstream establishment. Take Palestine. This, everyone knows, is a serious issue. And especially after 9/11, you would have thought it would be discussed. But the offensive of AIPAC and the Israeli embassy has meant that in the United States there has been no clear-cut debate on the future of that region and the future of the Palestinians as a people and Israel's own future. This should be being discussed by politicians instead of scaremongering. Israel is going to be wiped out. No one can wipe out Israel. It's got nuclear weapons. The only region, the only country in that region which has. So it's these absences and vacuums in American politics that are very disturbing, that everything's been narrowed down and democracy itself has increasingly become a shell in which people function. I mean, Obama had the opportunity to go on the offensive, but he was very careful, very cautious, and on the question of Pakistan, Afghanistan, even more aggressive than McCain, which was slightly shocking. It's almost as if he was trying to say, okay, I'm against the war in Iraq, we should have an exit strategy in Iraq, but I'm tough on Afghanistan.
A good war, yes.
I'm tough on Afghanistan, and go in there and send the troops from Iraq into Afghanistan. And then where will you send them from Afghanistan?
And that might be quite acceptable to neocon for the following reason. The reason being that the destruction that was meant for Iraq is already done. Nothing more can be done to gain anything. So we leave that and move elsewhere and do more damage there. So one of the ideas that seems to be, at least in the Arab state, people think the neocon agenda is not so much regime change or region change, but to destroy states and leave them rubble for next 20, 30 years. And that's the punishment they're going to give, not to change anything, but to destroy them, to punish them.
I don't think that was the, maybe the pro-Israeli neocons, that it might have been their agenda, but I think, naive though it sounds, there were a number of people who believed they could go in, install a secular government in Iraq, which would then become a platform for permanent U.S. bases in the area to replace the bases which they had lost in Saudi Arabia. Qatar, a very small country, is not a substitute. So control of the oil and control of the region dictated in the game plan to have American bases, permanent bases in Iraq. Some people say 5, some people say 13 or 30. But a country that was in rubble, in chaos, would not be a secure platform for those bases. I would like to say that this business of the narrowing of the issues that can be debated, there are 1 or 2 left, like whether we'll have a national health scheme or not. The underlying that is being the growth, really the takeover of what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, that the American economy now has been so militarized that it gives to both parties, and the result is what Gore Vidal aptly said, is one party with 2 right wings.
One property party with 2 right wings, yes,
Yes.
absolutely. But I think what I'm asking you is, it seems like in 2006, election results indicated there was a dissensus at the mass level and at the elite level in the approach to war in Iraq. But in 2008, the election process seems to be used to rebuild that consensus, to continue with the present policy. Do you read it that way?
I think inside the Democratic Party there has been a lot of Gleichhaltung, making the party hew to a line that is pro-Israeli, and there are dissenting voices in the Democratic Party, but all of the progressive candidates that I would have liked to have seen elected in 2006, the mainstream Democrats ran candidates against them, so that the Democratic Party, instead of being a real opposition, has been one of the ways of controlling opinion. And my explanation for that is ultimately money. You know, that the money is coming from the single source for both parties and freezing out the real alternatives. If this was a real democracy, I'm sure we would be out of Iraq very quickly. But I don't foresee that happening at all in the...
Right. Well, why own only one party when you can own both of them? So you give money to both sides.
And they can be bought so cheaply.
But there has been, over the last 30 years, a narrative that's been developing, and a message, and a whole climate of opinion and ideology from the right, which has talked about the need for military might, the need to ward off these external enemies. First it was the communists, now it's the terrorists and the like. And the Democrats are constantly being put in the position of looking soft or not being as tough. And so last night we heard Barack Obama, you know, that horrifying expression of his, "We'll go in and take them out," or something like he was ordering a hit from a mob or that sort of thing. So they've got to show they're tough. They live in constant fear that they are not, you know, that they're that the people are not going to have faith in their ability to lead in the world. And actually, I think the rank-and-file Democrats are way ahead of their leadership. They don't want that kind of thing. When Democratic speakers at the Democratic National Convention got up and talked about getting our place back, and so that we can resume our role as world leaders, there was absolute silence. That wasn't an applause line. These people don't want America to have to be the world leader, and there's no dialogue about those assumptions. Why do we have to be the world leader? What does that mean to be a world leader? What about taking care of things here at home and the like? It's very hard to get that dialogue going.
And here the media are a problem, that the media is so much more concentrated now than they were just even 20 years ago. Yeah. And so it's absolutely outrageous. I mean, thank God we have the internet, and there's a kind of clarity. I mean, of course, there's all kinds of junk on the internet, but if you search on the internet, you can find an area of decent debate and weighing of ideas. But there's a total disconnect between the rationality of the internet and the ideological
monopoly
of the, we call them the MSM now. All of the mainstream media together have become a single phenomenon. You can't expect any serious discussion from any of them.
But given that there may be an economic meltdown in this country, will it be simply because of the media that they lead to able to keep people down, or there's more complex explanations that need to be explored?
Well, I think that, you know, the fact is that the imposition of the Washington Consensus, the neoliberal economic system, policed by the top financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, and behind the scenes the US Treasury Department, tried to remold the world in the image of the United States. In Latin America, which was the first area where these experiments were launched, it's imploded. The US has never been more isolated in South America than it is today. And not only from the radical regimes of Chavez, Morales, Correa, and Lugo in now Paraguay, where Bolivarian has been elected, but also Lula in Brazil and Bachelet in Chile, who don't agree with Chavez on everything, but will not allow themselves to be used by the US against Bolivia or Venezuela. That's extremely important. And that is an area where the US is now out of control, with the exception of Colombia, which is their only total in that region.
Which they sustain by horrible bloodbaths.
Exactly.
And executions and death squads. Still to this day they're doing that.
And so the financial crisis in the United States and what has happened with the bubble bursting is now being discussed all over the world. That what they've imposed on us is blown up. The German government minister said, well, this is what they were pressuring us to do. Thank God we didn't. I mean, the Germans didn't go all the way. The British did, and there too now lots of trade unions are rising. Well, what's happened here because of that? Agha Saeed, to answer your question, the powers of trade unions, were virtually disappeared. The American working class, with the deindustrialization, did not remain a force which it could have been. So on the social level, the people who could have taken up the issues of this crisis are not there. That's been one result of it. But that doesn't mean that these issues shouldn't be and wouldn't be taken up by other people. Hence this opposition to the bailout coming from populist Republicans is coming because they know their base, and they're saying, why the hell should we bail these crooks out? That's what you're doing. You're using our money to bail out these guys and the corporations. And this is why a more social democratic plan on the model of the New Deal would go down much better. That's what the Democrats should be arguing for. We're going to give you a New Deal here and in the world.
Well, Michael, do you think that will be an issue in the next election? I doubt it.
I doubt it.
Next election meaning 2008 or 2012?
I mean, in November of this year.
Yeah.
You know, this social democratic, which Tariq mentions, it's a very intriguing term. In 1978, I have it in one of my books too, there were a number of financial leaders who said, we've got to do something about Jimmy Carter. We've got to do something. This country is moving toward a social democracy.
Exactly.
And we, or even worse, we can't do that. and from 78 to today, they have been whacking it down. Now, in a New Yorker magazine, just a couple of issues back, of course, I can't remember the exact citation and all. I'm not that good anymore. But anyway, they quoted, there was an article on the fact that the conservatives in the Republican Party are running out of issues. Like they don't quite, well, there's still Social Security, but that's about, and one or two other things, and gay marriage and that stuff, which some people are getting bored with. But one of these people said, one of the reasons we're running out of issues is because we've won. We prevented America from becoming a social democracy. He used the same term. They know what they're doing. You know, they really had an agenda, and the Democrats don't seem to have a clue about this sort of thing.
It began, I think, the whole of the 70s with the winding down of the Vietnam War. There was a huge debate among the upper class, the ruling class of America. We come out, as a youth, I said Marxism doesn't work very well in applying to America. It's worked very well since the Reagan Revolution of 1980.
It's class war.
But absolutely class war, starting with the crushing of the PATCO strike of the air controllers.
Yeah.
But all of that was being hatched through the 1970s. The first recognition with this essential failure in Vietnam that America was going to have to rethink its role in the world, and there was a debate between what my friend Michael Clare called the Prussians and the traders, the people who said America has traditionally been an economically dominant power and should continue to do that, versus the people who said, no, we need to have military superiority in order to maintain our role in the world. And the military people were probably a minority in the ruling class, but they had much more money from these big corporations like Hewlett-Packard, whose future really depended on the big defense budget.
But let's project it a little further, maybe 20 years from today. There are now a number of scholarly works by Kennedy, by Neil Ferguson at Harvard and others, and there are CIA studies by National Intelligence Council mapping the global future, which says in 20 years the world is going to go from unipolar to multipolar. Yeah. Chinese economy will expand beyond American economy.
Of course.
And there will be many powers of center that will compete with the United States. Given that's going to happen maybe in 20 years, combining with the fact that the people in this country, the demographic composition of this country is also changing. Latino population is going to be a very large component.
Asian too.
And also that the two generations of retired people, mostly will be European Americans, and most of the people who are working will be people of color. So given the dynamics of change internally and externally, how do we see this empire playing out next 20 years? What's the scenario for it in the next 2 decades, which is not a very long time in the life of nations?
Next 20 years. That's crystal ball. I'll leave it for you.
Could I just say, first of all, there are two alternative scenarios. One is with a major war, and the other is without. Now, of course, we would hope for the second alternative, and which would mean a rapid return to multilateralism, a change of policy in Washington in this respect. And I think the Democrats are capable of that. I don't think the Democrats are really wedded to the notion of unilateral dominance to the same extent as the Republicans, and even really a faction of the Republicans, the neocon faction. But absent some kind of rapid return to respect for international law, international treaties, everything that George W. Bush tore up when he first came in 2001. If we don't get that kind of initiative from America, then I think, first of all, the risks of war in the world are very big, and the risks of that expanding into, say, if America continues to act as it does now and drives Russia and China together, which is not really the situation at present, as we saw in Georgia, then it's up to America really to take the first steps to avoid that kind of risk for war.
Peter, it is true that Bush after 9/11 and the neocons, totally backed by the Likud party in Israel and AIPAC, decided to go for break, you know, fight Iraq, occupy Afghanistan, all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, I think it's worth noting that there is a continuity between the previous administration.
I agree.
Clinton totally ignored the United Nations when he used NATO to bomb Yugoslavia. It was under the Clinton-Albright administration that sanctions against Iraq, which wrecked many, many things in that country and killed, you know, 500,000 kids, took place without causing any big flurry in the world, in the Western world at large. But so I think there are some problems here about whether the Democrats will be able to pull out.
That's the theme of my book. You go back further to the previous Democratic president, Carter. Carter was actually elected on a campaign promise to cut the defense budget. And under his presidency, thanks to the Rockefeller-inspired leadership of Zbigniew Brzezinski in the National Security Council, he presided over what we think of as the Reagan budget increases, but were actually drafted and planned under Carter. There has been this continuous...
In the last 2 years of his term, that's when he made the switch. He got the word that not this way, it's this way you go. Right. And that's when he started cutting back on human services and started increasing military spending.
But there has been this trend, continuous. That's why I call my book The War
He set up Reagan before Reagan took over.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so that is remains a central problem in American politics. Now, what will happen over the next 25 years? One thing is just beyond dispute, that China today is the workshop of the world. That's what Western policies have created. Virtually everything you see is made in China. And from that point of view, it's a situation which is analogous to the role played by Britain in the 19th century after the Industrial Revolution. So what impact is this going to have on the world at large? Is the Chinese economy not totally dominated by the free market, as we know full well, but with state intervention as well, is going to move on and on? What impact will it have? Let me tell you that when the United States announced that it wanted bases in perpetuity in Afghanistan, and the NATO Secretary General Joop Scheffer told the Brookings Institution that the reason we are in Afghanistan is it's not nation building or good governance, and not even really Al-Qaeda. It's because Afghanistan is a strategically important country on the borders with China, Iran, and there were riots in every Afghan city because people didn't want it. And for the first time ever, once that happened, China and Russia carried out joint military maneuvers in that region. Not noticed by the US press, but I cite all the facts in my latest book. So it's not that they don't see what's going on, and do not underestimate China. Pakistan, for instance, is run, or not run, but there are three big lobbies in Pakistan. The American lobby, which is currently running the country, the Saudi lobby, which operates more in a more shifty way through various politicians, and the China lobby, which operates exclusively within the military, makes no proposals on the politics of the country, stays out of the country's internal life. And the Chinese have made it very clear to the Pakistani military, we are not going to tolerate permanent US bases on our border, like the Russians did when they started putting missiles in, threatening to put missiles in Poland, Czechoslovakia.
Hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, it hasn't happened yet. So I think the US and its allies are going to find the going difficult if they carry on in this way, trying to remake the world in their own image when their own world is collapsing. That's the key thing. So it's the crash, the economic crash, combined with the crises in Afghanistan and Iraq, is going to make this a model which no one wants to even look at seriously, including within the European countries.
Let me ask the very last question. Do we see the possibility of an international civil society coming to the fore and playing a role of restraining the empire in the intervening period between now and 25 years, when the world will be a different world and hopefully better regulated? You and I talked that previously.
We saw that, some of that in February 2003, before the U.S. went and attacked Iraq. I'd never seen demonstrations against a war before it ever started. So
never.
After the bombs start falling, then they react. And not only that, but it was global. We saw demonstrations in Osaka, Japan, in Finland, in Lithuania, in Mexico, Nigeria. These are countries that don't have a really close cultural or historical link to Iraq at all. But they were saying, they were serving notice saying, you can't be the rulers of the planet. You can't decide who shall live and who shall die, which country you can attack with impunity and which one you can't. And so they demonstrated out of Iraq, out of regard for Iraq, but also out of regard for themselves. And even among the American people, when they're not sufficiently frightened and reality seeps in a little bit, there really is a reluctance to pursue these far-off wars. You've got to keep frightening them and saying the terrorists going to get you, going to get your mama, going to, they're right under your bed. But they really, many of them are concerned about health care and housing and this whole meltdown that's now taking place. I just had a friend of mine send me an email saying his solution for this thing is don't spend the $700 billion. Let the free market play itself out. He had two solutions. The first one was let the free market play itself out, and the second solution involved guillotines. So he didn't. So he didn't go into that one.
I'd like to say I am very pessimistic is the wrong word. I'm very concerned that we are in a period where war is a real possibility. At the same time,
when you say war, we're in 3 wars right now.
No,
2.5
yes, but not
you mean
wars.
With Russia, something big.
Yes,
like
something
that.
much bigger. Because we've had wars pretty constantly. Yes,
Right.
ever since America summoned up its might and invaded Grenada, we have had, and then Panama. It's been building and building.
But that's who they attack. It's Grenada, Panama. They have never attacked a country that has nuclear powers.
Anyway,
nuclear weapons. Never attacked
that
a
was a premise to saying that I'm really quite hopeful for the long term is clearly on the side of international comity and civil society because of the infrastructure that we're now getting. The internet allows people to communicate all around the world. Americans are forced otherwise to choose between the Washington Post and the New York Times. They can get on the internet and read the European press, the British press, the Pakistani press. This is a necessary condition for a global society, and it's a huge breakthrough. And of course, there's always the risk that the successors to the neocons will take away freedom of the internet, and we have to watch for that. But the trend in the world is towards a more egalitarian sharing of knowledge and communications, breaking down the monopolies that have been exercised by the major powers. So yes, the answer to your question, despite the risk of war, is we are moving in that direction of an international society.
Well, I hope that international civil society gets its act together because, as has been said, They came out to stop the Iraq war, but when they failed, they went back in again. And that was very demoralizing, the fact that they'd failed. And most people who came out had never participated in any political act before. They were huge, these demonstrations, and they had an impact. I think that in some ways, the most important segment of international civil society are the citizens of the United States of America. I don't want to exaggerate this, but I think in the future does depend on how they develop. And so one has to fight for civil liberties in the United States so people are allowed to express their opinions. We are seeing, as you mentioned earlier, a transformation of this society in terms of who lives here. Their composition, their color, their religions. It's no longer a single society. And these people, over the next 25 to 30 years, especially the kids born in this country, are going to play a role, one hopes, and not be cowed down by the rulers. And that could begin to change the United States itself. You know, the fact that you now have a bridge, a permanent bridge of Latinos who are interested in what's going on back home. They're not like the early immigrants who had no access to news or internet, didn't know what was going on at home. The immigrants who came from Italy in the early years of the last century. These people coming here have links with Mexico, with Venezuela, with Central America. So you had a permanent picket outside the Mexican consulate in LA when they were repressing the citizens of Oaxaca. And that, I think, is a sign of hope. And you have, you know, a sizable minority of American Muslims who live in this country and who play a big role in keeping the hospitals going. You know, play their part as citizens, paying their taxes.
Large number of engineers.
And engineers. And these are people who have to play a role in society. And if they don't, their kids will.
And the empire does have...
Very last word is yours, okay. Go ahead.
Well, the empire does have an Achilles heel, this global empire, which is the manpower. We talked about troop power, if you will. We already talked about that. They're running short of troops, and they're fighting only two little wars. I mean, really, two second-rate wars, and they're having a hard time feeding this global war machine. So there are vulnerabilities in this empire. When looking at its immense abuses and strengths, we should also look at these vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. I think the whole project of the neocons can be summed up with the title of Samuel Huntington's two books, The Clash of Civilization, and also his new book, relatively new book, called Who We Are. One is directed towards other countries and civilizations, other is directed towards minorities in this country, particularly Latino minority. And I think partly the future of this country is going to be shaped by the answer majority of people give to Samuel Huntington's two challenges. Are we going to be at permanent war with the rest of the world, or are we going to exclude and quarantine and oppress minorities in this country, particularly Latinos who are in the position of becoming majorities in several states? This discussion, friends, will continue in many other settings. Thank you. Thank you, sir.